Okay, welcome to episode 112 of the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm one of the VPs at Sumer Sports. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff, the CEO of Sumer Sports. Thomas, firstly, we both have mics now. We got ring lights in the studio here. You're in your office with the awesome walls. I think we've traded up here in this world. How is it going here on this Wednesday afternoon?
It's going well. I mean, by the way, I just happened to revisit the slow motion video with Mark Davis. Spouted something off like a-hole. Can we just lead in on that for a minute? I think it's hilarious. I mean, who was he saying that to? Was he saying it to Josh? Was he saying it to his quarterback? Was he saying it to the woman beside him? By the way, I think she's 28 years old if you see the video. But
I did notice that, and I got to be honest with you, not to be like, if I'm in her company and I'm him, I'm gonna behave. I'm gonna be on my best behavior. I like, he's in Las Vegas now. He should know, if you're ahead, you just walk away from the table. You don't keep playing. You don't keep, it was a weird. What was he saying that about? Because they won the game the other day against the Packers. I know that there was some tense moments there where the Packers took the lead and everything, but it was not mesmerizing. It was odd to watch for me as well, Thomas.
it was a decision, as you remember, and I remember watching it live. It was a decision to kick versus, finish it off. And it was funny because I know that the talent was being facetious with him, of course. I think it was Joe Buck, right? Is that who it would have been, I think?
Must have been, yeah. Joe Buck and Troy Aikman.
Yeah, and I think Joe was busting on him a little bit. So anyway, the only reason I bring that up is we talk about owners often, right? We talk about some very interesting and good to work with, others more complicated to work with, others, you wouldn't want to work with at all. Many, many times, just so you know, and I used to hear this, I think I mentioned this to you, head coaches, they always say, look, I would work, when they first get a kick off their careers as senior level, right? So as a head coach or as a GM, we would always say, like, oh, I'd work for 32 owners. And that goes down precipitously, right? As you start moving through, you get a couple years under your belt, you're like, man, I wouldn't work for half of the owners in the league. And then before you know it, at least that's what people banter about. And I think it's kind of funny when I hear people say that, because I'm thinking, no, you would work for any one of the owners. You just have to understand that personalities are different, right?
Yeah.
Why would you ever close that door and say you would only work for a handful of owners?
Well, I also think that it's obviously it's turning your back on an opportunity to grow. I think that, for example, I was in La Crosse, Wisconsin this weekend to celebrate my book, and I was talking to a few professors, and we were sort of talking about the difference between working as a professor and working in private industry, and some of the pushbacks and drawbacks. And one of them that I came to was, when you're a professor, like, everybody you interact with has sort of the same qualifications as you. Now, there are some people who are better, there are some people who are worse, but everybody has the same qualifications. In private industry, you don't have that, and for better or worse, right? You have diamonds in the rough that you can build up. You have people who surprise you. You have other people who may disappoint you, but it all is an opportunity to grow, of course. It's interesting, and I think it depends. Like, right, when you're a first-time GM, you probably would take all 32 jobs. Maybe when you're maybe in your position where you've had an opportunity, you've had success, you can be a little bit more picky. But I think at the very beginning, a lot of my friends who are in the league and who I think aspire to be that way will often talk to me about, like, well, no, I'd stand up for myself if the owner told me to do this or that or the other thing. Like, and I'm like, I don't know. I think that's with the benefit of not actually having sat in that chair.
Yeah, it's not always easy to stand up. I mean, yes, you're expected to stand up. You're expected to state your point, no question about it. But it only goes so far. And I've used this line before. Before you know it, you have what we call in this world the golden handcuffs. You're making millions and millions of dollars a year. You're thinking about your family. You're thinking about your education that you're putting your kids through. And you start thinking about the life things. You're like, my God, why would I want to shoot myself in the foot here? Be smart about how I interact with the owner. Don't get into a pissing match every turn you take, and just be smart about how you're putting together your team along with your owner. It's really, it's not that difficult, of course.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of, there's a really interesting topic that's going through, the NFL right now. And I think it also coincides with some interesting work that we're doing at Sumer. And so I want to get your opinion on this, because I've always thought that player evaluations, when you look at it from an analytical perspective, they move way too quickly, right? A player, whether that be like Pro Football Focus grades or expected points added or WAR or whatever, I think that the analytics community moves way too quickly on players. One guy's fifth one week, and then he has a bad week and he's 25th and all this kind of stuff. But when we turn it on the other side, and this is where I think people would really find your experience edifying, Thomas, is opinions when it comes to like scouting grades. So you guys watch film, you put a grade on a player. That doesn't happen all that often. That doesn't happen every week. I know that for sure. And it might only happen a few times a season, which can lead to some interesting things, right? For example, it'd be like a guy like Brock Purdy, who, was taken last pick in the 7th round 2 years ago in the draft, is clearly producing for the 49ers. But I think a lot of people are questioning whether or not he's actually a good player or whether he's being propped up. But there's also the whole thing about like somebody like Randy Gregory, who 2 years ago signed a 5-year, $70 million deal, and just a year and 4 games into it is basically being cut. Now, the Broncos never actually cut him, and so they ended up trading him to the 49ers for a late pick. But what I wanted to ask you was, how often do these evaluations change? And if they change as slowly as I think they do, how does that influence your ability to build a team, especially in the middle of a season where there are going to be opportunities that arise, but maybe their new information is going to make you override your grade on a player? How does that work, Thomas?
Okay, so the first thing is, by the way, Randy Gregory, as you know, I know he's a Nebraska guy. Yeah. And when Dan Quinn and I were out when we were scouting him and trying to think about one day bringing him on board, he was going through a lot of issues, right? He didn't just leave because he can't rush the passer now. I would almost guarantee that there is something from a character standpoint that's just rubbing the wrong way, right? That's just unfortunately what happens. So that's a segue into what we're talking about here, grading. So every year, an NFL staff will have their pro scouting staff will be responsible for a certain amount of teams, right? So if you had 5 or 4 pro scouts, you would divide the entire league up, and each scout would be responsible to be the expert of that team, and they would be responsible for all of the roster, evaluating the entire roster on that team, right? And then and every year you grade as an NFL team, at least in a depth and focused pro personnel department, they will grade the entire league every year. So what happens is these scouts, these pro scouts, are also responsible. If they have 6 teams they're responsible for, they're also responsible to advance for the coaching staff, right? So run this, watch all the video and advance and write up all the players that the team will be playing, and they will be responsible to put a grade on those players, right, across the league. The non-competing teams, so like the rest of the league that is not going to be covered in advances by your pro scouting staff, by the end of the year, every team usually has their pro scouting department responsible to make sure that they grade the remainder of the league. So again, the 17 games that you play, 17 now, right? Not 18.
Yep, 17. Yep.
The 17 games that you play are all advanced, and that's all done. The remainder of the league will be responsible for the rest of the pro scouts to evaluate and eventually put a grade on them. Okay, there, every year. And on the college side, every year, all of the college players coming into the league will have a grade on them. And so every year that churns around, right? So every year pro scouts are evaluating and putting a new grade on. Now think about this. That's easy if you're not doing anything. Sometimes they remain a little bit dormant, Eric, right? So if you're not looking at a guy and 2 years down the road or 3 years down the road, all of a sudden the guy becomes available. Only that one scout that is evaluating that player put a grade on him. The rest of the team, meaning the GM, the assistant GM, the personnel directors, they're not looking at that player until maybe there's a trade involved, or maybe he's cut and he's available. That's when there's a revisit, rewatch, and regrade of that player. So you might have graded someone 4 years ago as a general manager or personnel director, and might not grade him for another 4 years. Your team, however, will grade once a year.
Got it. So do you think, because that's really good insight, right? Do you think, does that create any bias at all? So let's say you really like to, so I see this all the time. Like I look at Kansas City, who's obviously a model franchise, and I look at like what their in-season moves. They've picked up a number of what I would call failed first-round picks. Kadarius Toney was traded for last year. DeAndre Baker was picked up a previous year. Kelvin Benjamin was picked up a previous year. The Cam Irving was traded for in one season. Reggie Ragland was traded for. And I always got the impression that these were guys that Brett Veach liked, right? There was like a little bit of, I can't remember. Yeah. There was a report that like he really liked Ronald Jones coming out of USC, and funny, when he's a free agent for the first time, they signed him to a contract. And, hardly any of those players ended up working for the Chiefs. Tony's had his moments, but for the most part, it's been a disappointment. And does it bias you at all when like the general manager comes in and says, "Hey, we have an offer on the table for Kadarius Toney. I need you to regrade him." Like, how does that, could it elicit some bias where your boss is saying, I'm interested in this player, I need you to slap a grade on him? Like, because I could see some bias possibly creeping into the process there a little bit.
Look, usually that situation starts by an agent calling me, or potentially, usually it is, and the teams and GMs don't like to know that, right? They would rather a GM call another GM, "Hey, you have any interest in, X player, whatever, a certain player?" And I would say, let me get back to you. What are you thinking? Well, I'm thinking a second, and I'm thinking a fifth, and a future, whatever it may be, right? Mm-hmm. We would have a conversation. We'd hang up the phone. I would get on the phone right away, and I'd reach out. Usually I'd reach out to my AGM, or I'd reach out to my personnel director, and I would say, "Look, put an eye on the player that we're talking about. Watch, give me put an eye on him, see if it's worth us looking at this player. The Dolphins are really interested in moving him, and this is the so-called price they're maybe looking at. I just need to know if it's worth us doing any more work." That's how we would start the process. At that point, and they would be responsible to watch. Usually in our situation, when you're talking about a trade, it's probably 7 to 10 games. Like, it's legit. We're not going to just jump in. Now, if our scout gets in 3 or 4 games and the guy's just flailing all over the place and there's no way, or he's dead in the water, meaning basically he's no longer functioning as he used to, and he's no longer a 68, he is now a 58. And my scout or our scout would come back, or our personnel director would come back and say, "Look, he is a backup. No way does he beat one of our guys out. If you want to trade for him down the line, great. If not, boom." And if I look at him and I'm like, "Yeah, I still don't know about that," I might get a couple more people in our building to watch and evaluate. So now all of a sudden you have three grades on him, and then I'll get to a spot where I will want to watch him. Most GMs will put an eye on a player, right? That's just not in their makeup to say, "I'm just going to listen to my personnel director and put my butt on the line on it," right? I'm going to go and spend time. But I do want people to break it down before I get there, so I know that I'm not wasting my time.
Well, and you see with like non-scout GMs, right? You see like Howie Roseman has almost always done a really good job with midseason trades, but somebody like Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, who's not a scout, he's an analytics guy like me. He's been more mixed, right? He hit on TJ Hawkinson, that now TJ Hawkinson's the highest paid tight end in football, but he missed on Jalen Reagor. He missed on Ross Blacklock, who are both gone after he traded for them last year. And that last set of eyes, of course, is maybe, I don't know what that process is, but it's interesting to me that in the non-evaluator GMs, how different the outcomes have possibly been. I think that's a really interesting thing, because for most people and most people in the public, right, they're looking at stats, they're looking at PFF grades, they're looking at whatever, and you guys are literally going in and evaluating the player again as if you were coming out of college, not coming out of college, because it's a different set of scouts. It's pro and college. But the other question that I had is, do you do a thorough eval on the character? Because I know that's a big thing, that when you look at public people, like, you look at public boards and everything with players, unless that information is public, it does not get into the draft boards. And oftentimes it's those intangible things that are the reason why a team is moving off a player. How do you discern that information? Because if I'm trading with you, I'm probably not going to tell you that, hey, this guy is eating Cheerios every morning instead of his actual nutrition plan and stuff like that. Like, how do you end up discerning that information? Because that could probably break a tie as to whether or not you want to actually make a move versus not.
Yeah. So hold that point for 1 second. I would say to you as well, when you look at some of these players and you're evaluating, and they're aging, right, and their grades are changing, I think it is really important for that organization. When I said most teams, this is me projecting. Many teams in the NFL are grading every player in the league every year. That's the smart way to do it, for this very reason. There are still some laissez-faire organizations out there that don't have a big pro scouting staff. They have a substantial college scouting staff. They only grade the teams that they're advanced scouting, right? The teams that they play. And the other teams, they just let them cycle through over the next 2 or 3 years, when they end up being in the group of games that they're playing and they're advancing. And when I say advancing, remember, this is writing up the players, evaluating the players, and also providing advanced elements to the coaching staff. But I just want to make sure that not every team evaluates, and there's a problem. All of a sudden, the GM is hit with a question on a player, and then the whole staff has to scramble around to try to figure out, God, we haven't evaluated this guy in 3 years. What truly is he? And then there's a lot of scrambling, of course. And to me, it's an ineffective use of time and inefficient use of time. I want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah, to me, that feels like, because I'm pretty radical in this, or I've been radicalized by our time here at Sumer to know that, like, you need some sort of human evaluation to go along with your statistical evaluation. And oftentimes that those like boundary cases we talked about on last Wednesday's show, where the math gets you 80% of the way there, but it's the wrong 80% a lot of times in this situation, where a player's available because of the stuff that a scout type can discern, but the math can't go in and say, hey, this guy's been a character issue, this guy hasn't gelled. Math can kind of discern scheme stuff, but it's a lot of times it's that external stuff or injuries or things like that like we don't have information about in the public, and you won't have information about if it's vis-a-vis a player on another team. That could be the reason why he is available, and that's just hard to deal with. There's a really good question by Sean here, who's a frequent listener to the show. Are those grades that you guys have independent of situation? In other words, if you have a high grade on a corner, but he plays in a zone heavy scheme, do you have the same grade if you play a ton of man? I think that's a great question, right? Because one of the things that I was ignorant of when I first started working with you is this idea that scouts are not necessarily coaches, in the sense of you're grading how talented a player is. You're not necessarily trying to grade how talented he is in the context of the scheme that you have. And the schemes change so much in the NFL from year to year anyway, you wouldn't really even want to do that. Then how do you, in that case, like, let's say you put a grade on a guy and he's a 6, right? And he's available to you, and all the external information is him performing like a 4, let's say, in a scheme that maybe he's not suited for. How do you make that adjustment on the fly in the middle, in the heat of the moment, when you are, working out a deal for a possible player like that?
Well, look, it really starts, it's a really good question. It really starts off by, at the core, evaluating the player for what he is, all the metrics. So for instance, a corner that might have 20 metrics, we will evaluate throughout all of the metrics and come up with our final score. And quite honestly, how that player is written up in the final, there are many, many different ways to approach this, but in the summary and how it's actually, the verbiage of the write-up is really key, right? Because you could say this player is very athletic. He's got all the, whatever, however you're pitching it, right? Great hips, explosiveness, turn and run, has the ball skills that you need, much more suitable for a zone, a press scheme versus, zone. And within the final, within the final write-up, the final sentences of that summary stating what he is. That grade, however, will be based off of purely as a corner in the league. And then you let the coaches look at it who know the scheme and try to, basically apply that player to the proper scheme. So for instance, way back, there was a guy named Dante Robinson. Do you ever remember that name?
Yeah, he played, he was a slot guy for the Houston Texans before he came to your team.
Exactly. Came to us. We put him out at corner. Well, he was a corner too, but UGA guy, tough, right? Was best up, right? Nutting up right at the line. We tried to play him back, right? So we graded him really high. We paid him a lot of money, but Mike Nolan decided he wanted to play him off the ball. So we played him back, and he just was not that guy, right? He wasn't an off man guy. But we graded him a very high grade. It was a 7+. So he was a legitimate guy, and we paid a ton of money for him. But we didn't put him in the right spot. The point is, that's how we approached him. If we would have graded him strictly as as an off corner, he might have been a 59, and we never would have made the move. So it is really, really important to know what the scheme is. But we try to dissuade our scouts from grading for the scheme. Make sure we grade the player for the grade the player is. And then at that point, we discern whether he fits into our scheme or not.
Well, and I think that's okay. So there's 3 ways I want to take this because it's so interesting. I think the first way I want to take it is all the way back to your Patriot days, right? Because what was Belichick's edge for so long, and then by extension, you and Pioli and everybody that was with him, was you guys would run schemes that no one else was running. In the early 2000s, it was basically you guys, it was Pittsburgh, and I think Carolina with Dom Capers, and then eventually was somebody else running the show there that would run a 3-4. And so you guys would get huge values on the Vince Wilforks and the Ted Washingtons and the Ty Warrens and the Jarvis Greens of the world, because they were playing a position that no one else really valued. And so if you watch them, and what's really interesting is back in the day, like no one ran a 3-4 in college either. So you guys were like trying to scout a guy for his ability to play in a system that no one else was playing. And in my opinion, as a math guy, you guys had an incredible advantage, because if my math is going to look, okay, let's filter down to all the plays where a guy plays a 5-tech in a 3-4 scheme, it's going to be like 6 plays. And there's nothing I can discern from that. Whereas you guys are able to sort of look at traits and see if, and it's still a guess, but it's a better guess than what I have with almost no data. And so like that's incredible as well. But it also gets to this idea, and I want to go back to the Dante Robinson thing, which was not only did you sign him and he had this job description, which was to be tough ass man corner, press up, play inside in the nickel and play outside in base. But you guys, if I'm not mistaken, lost Brett Grimes one of those years. And so the reason he had to play outside was a circumstance that you had no control over, really, which is an injury. And so when somebody looks back at your record, Thomas, as a general manager, I don't think people look at that and say, oh, well, he signed Dante Robinson, this big deal. It worked out okay, but it could have been better. No one comes back around and says, well, he signed with this job description and he actually had to have a different job description. And so maybe we should grade the signing a little bit on a curve. I know that we've talked about this before, but like, I think that is also an important thing where it's like, when you make a signing, the players got to have expectations that are spelled out. And when those expectations change for reasons that you have no control over as a general manager, I think the evaluation of the player changes.
Yeah, the valuation changes for sure. I personally have this desire with Sumer to really dig into a lot of the moves that have been made and do a lot more of a sort of a mathematical deduction on why moves are working and not working, right? I mean, the reality is that an owner will say, it is what it is, man. I hired you to win, and it's all about W's, right? Those of us who have been in that seat, however, know that there are so many layers, coaches included, right? GMs and head coaches can sit around talking over many, many, many bottles of wine about why something worked or didn't work, right? All the way down to, and not to get into the weeds here, beyond the head coach and the general manager, all the way down beyond the coordinator, and what I've stressed many, many times, down to the position coach, who just was not a good developing position coach. Might have been a good scheme guy, whatever it may be. There's so many things that could have played in, right? There are so many elements that would lend itself to a player working or not working. When it comes back around to a grade, because I want to stay on that, when you talk about grading players in this league, and you talk about, as an organization, continuing to keep your grades fresh and clean, that to me is the only way to do it. Because truly, if you aren't grading yearly, you don't have a firm grasp of what truly is out there, and it becomes dormant, which I mentioned before. And now you make rash decisions, right? In my mind, you make rash decisions on your own players. Just remember, everyone, we grade all of our players at the end of the season. We usually, as a staff, the coach and the coaching staff will grade from their perspective. The personnel staff, the GM and the personnel staff will grade, and then we will come to some final decision on what our final grade is going to be on that player, our own team, going into the rest of the season. Excuse me. That can be all over the place, as you can imagine, right, Eric? It's not just by one scout. This is about many people on a team.
Right. And there are, I mean, we tried to do this we wanted to do this at Pro Football Focus, but kind of like adjust the grades for the grader. I know in a past life, I used to judge for a mathematics competition out of Philadelphia called SIAM. And they had an algorithm where they would change your grade based upon like who you were in your history. There was a calibration set and all that. Like, obviously, I think that's the future of scouting. But yeah, it's such an interesting question. And it gets me to kind of like the genesis of why I wanted to talk about this in the first place, which is quarterbacks, because, and I'm going to present right now at Sumer Sports here on, so sumersports.com, where you go to quarterbacks page. I'm going to go ahead and share that part here, because the all the rage is right now, and we're actually going to have Steven Ruiz on the show on Friday for what I normally do for the Friday show, which is usually solo. But right now there's this hang up over the fact that a lot of people don't think Brock Purdy is particularly good, and yet when you watch that team play, the San Francisco 49ers, he is leading the league in expected points added in the passing game. And I think a lot of us know that Brock Purdy's not the best quarterback. You look down a couple, right? Josh Allen is among one of the league's best. Patrick Mahomes was the MVP of the league last year. Justin Herbert is also fantastic. You have this confluence, and I think that there should be some sort of space, Thomas, to have two different kinds of quarterbacks, right? In the same way that we used, still likely have free and strong safety, where you have one guy who's kind of more of a distributor, and you have another guy that's more of a everything everywhere all at once kind of player. And if you divorce those, right, I think that you actually get a pretty accurate rating. Like, if you watch the NFL this year, Brock Purdy and Tua Tagovailoa are executing an offense that is really well constructed.
Yeah.
And actually, difficult has a good point. Three kinds. Want to put Mahomes in his own tier if you want to. But basically you have guys that execute an offense incredibly well, and then you have guys who are more of the whole plane is built around them type of thing. And I think you're going to get closer to the truth because frankly, Thomas, when it comes down to whether it's like fantasy football or whether it's betting or something like that, if you just go by the numbers, you're going to be led astray when a guy like Brock Purdy has perturbations, meaning George Kittle gets injured, Trent Williams gets injured. The league catches up to some of the stuff that Kyle Shanahan does, all this stuff. Whereas a guy like Mahomes is going to be more impervious to changes around him. I think that traditional scouting can help us get to that answer in a way that maybe I think statisticians like me are uncomfortable with. So
let me drop back for a second. Where do you think Purdy should be rated? I mean, you look at EPA. Can you bring that back up again? I hate to do that to you, but
no, you're good.
I'm really curious.
Luckily, it's still up here.
Oh, okay.
Bang. There we go.
You're good. Okay. So, I mean, what do you think that top 5 ranking is? And do you think Purdy belongs in let's just get philosophical here. Do you think Purdy belongs in the top 10?
So I think if you order this and just say these are passing offenses, I think the ranking is fine.
That he's number 1 overall?
Oh yeah, I think the Niners passing offense is the top passing offense in football. The question is how much of the credit do you give to the quarterback? And I think from a scouting perspective, it's how does that translate? So if you switch Mahomes and Purdy, what happens is I think the question. And I think if Brock Purdy was given the responsibilities of the Kansas City Chiefs offense, I think it would be much worse, right, than if Patrick Mahomes is the quarterback. I think if you gave Patrick Mahomes the responsibilities of the San Francisco 49ers offense, in some ways, I think he'd be bored, but I think that they would have even better production. In my opinion, I think Purdy's probably a top 15 quarterback in the NFL. Mm-hmm. I can't say top 10 yet. I can't, just because we don't have the counterfactual. Like I mean, we saw when he was at Iowa State and the situation wasn't particularly clean. The production wasn't there. I mean, he in fact regressed, from freshman year to sophomore year to junior year, slightly better his senior year than he was his junior year. And so we have that information. It's just that in the NFL so far, he's executed this offense really, really well. And so it's just a really hard problem because I don't want to ding him for doing his job, but I also want, again, like from a betting perspective, let's say Purdy's injured and Sam Darnold will have to start. How much do you move the probability of the 49ers of winning that game? It's something, but it's not as nearly as much as if you put Mahomes and take him out and put Blaine Gabbert in.
It's complicated because, I mean, Brock Purdy, of course, continues to get better and better. I mentioned last year, though I was very impressed with what he did, that give D coordinators out there a year to hone in on him, and we'll see truly what he is. I mean, here he is, 5 games in. I mean, to your point, like these are impressive numbers, 71.5% completion percentage, right? And yep. I mean, I'm looking here, I don't know, where's his ADOT, right? 7.6 depth of target. I mean, that's kind of right in the mid pack, isn't it? Give or take.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All I'm saying is what he's doing is
it's a little on the middle of the pack, a little on the low end.
Little bit on the low end. I start thinking about a coach, as we do on Kyle Shanahan, who is fantastic at taking those quarterbacks, right? Who might not be the most adept in making the most out of them. I think he does a fantastic job with that. I mean, I think it's amazing. Brock Purdy, when you watch him, he's got confidence kind of coming out of his ears right now. The team is behind him. I hear them continuing to rave about him. He's got damn good targets that he's working with, right? And look, I mean, it's impressive, but how long does it last? And does he take him to the Super Bowl? when I heard someone, and I don't know if we talked about it this last year in the spring during the draft time, that there was talk in that building that one of the ex-players, I think it might have been Jerry Rice, but don't quote me on it, anyone, that he said, this is Joe Montana. I mean, that's a big, big deal in my mind, if someone's comparing you to a quarterback like that.
Well, and I think that's where this entire thing gets really difficult, Thomas, which is you've dealt with this in your career. I think Joe Montana and Tom Brady are two guys who played for elite coaches, Bill Walsh and Bill Belichick, and who grew from what I would consider to be Purdy-like quarterbacks. Joe Montana was a 3rd-round pick. Tom Brady was a 6th-round pick. The first few years of Brady's career, it was defense, the running game, and Tom Brady really grew into the guy who became the everything, everywhere, all at once quarterback. And so I think when we look at Purdy and we want to say he could be like, and again, I don't want to sound hyperbolic, but like we look at Purdy and we say he could be the next Brady. I think that there are shades of, okay, he's been given a lot, but he's done a lot with it. And if you give that player the experience you talk about, he looks confident, he looks like he's getting better. That to me screams Tom Brady, right? Tom Brady, when he first started out, I mean, you remember that year where he was like determining whether he was going to wear gloves or whether and like he was struggling, and it wasn't like 2006. That wasn't an efficient year, and he had Jabbar Gaffney and Rashay Caldwell and like guys that, and then you put that great 2017 around him, and he becomes the MVP. That was the first time that anybody ever looked at Tom Brady individually and said this is a superstar quarterback. And so Joe Montana similarly, like Joe Montana won a Super Bowl in '81. But like at the end of his career, you could totally see when he got to Kansas City, he was the difference maker, right? By then, he was the difference maker. And so when I think about people kind of bagging Purdy, I think to myself, like, don't be so quick, right? Because as everybody knows, all you need to give some people in life is confidence and a platform from which to improve. And that's where I get a little bit nervous about player evaluations because the scout player evaluations don't change very often. And the analytics ones, in my opinion, change too fast. I think that's the drawback of putting a label on a player. And this isn't you guys and teams, but I'm saying, like, I'm talking about like kind of generally putting a label on a player and then not being able to appreciate when they improve. Because a lot of people looked at Brady versus Peyton Manning, were like, well, Manning's the better player. And I think for the most part in their career, that was true. But at some point in Brady's career, he became the quarterback that was impervious to almost anything. And so with a guy like Purdy, I listened to you talk, and you're saying like all the stuff that kind of people are saying about Brady, and it's happening at an accelerated pace with Purdy.
It is. How big is Purdy right now? What do we think he is?
I think he's like 6'2", 230. I mean, he's
6'2". Okay,
I gotta make sure, but let me look at this quickly.
Yeah, as you're looking, I don't know. I sit there and I switch to other quarterbacks out there who, have some good games here and there. I mean, let's take Desmond Ridder for an example, right? Everyone thinks Desmond, like, see, he's a player. And my feeling on that is it takes time, right? Just because he has one game doesn't mean when the crap hits the fan that he's going to be able to hang. Maybe he is, right? We're with Brock Purdy right now. I mean, things are rolling, right? They're all O-line. People are the teams are playing well. They're running, McCaffrey's doing what he's doing. And I'm always amazed at how hard he runs and what he does for that offense. Yep. They're just in a really good spot right now. And back to the credit to the head coach who's getting the most out of that offense. I think it's fantastic. The only reason I bring up Desmond Ridder is, okay, look at Ridder. Everyone's complaining about him. He plays this last game better than he played, the other ones. He was darting some balls in there. And there's going to be another game very quickly, soon, that's going to go the opposite way, right? He's going to be tossing them into the other hands. I'm not being negative about him. I'm just saying that's the ups and downs of a quarterback's, evolution.
Well, and that's what people have been expecting Purdy to do, but like He hasn't been intercepted yet. Like I mean, it's exactly, I think, what you're saying, which is to say, when those guys, I think in many people's minds are similarly graded. I think Purdy has probably eclipsed him a little bit. But yeah, I mean, again, like I said, if you give people a platform, this is, the educator to me, you give people a platform, you reinforce their success with more success. And I think that, and in a similar way, let's back this up and look at the other side. Carson Wentz had all of the tools to be in that second category, that big, strong, physical, great arm, good brain, like all this stuff. And the Eagles, and it wasn't anybody's fault, but like injuries, both to him and to the players around him. There was that one year in 2019, Thomas, where he had 4,000 yards passing. He was the first NFL player with 4,000 yards passing with no one wide receiver having over 500 yards.
Yeah.
I think of like Justin Herbert. I think like everybody's like, well, Herbert's too good to fail. And it's like, well, if you keep testing, if you keep putting him in situations that make him frustrated, or you don't give him that success by nurturing him and surrounding him, I'm not saying he's going to end up like Wentz, but I get worried sometimes, right? And I think about Andrew Luck. I think about whether it was his injuries, but the offensive line, it was supporting cast, and like I think the other side's true too. Like if you nurture a player, he can become that player that ultimately doesn't need that support, like Tom Brady. But if you don't nurture the player, they can lose some of that talent.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, Tom was amazing, and he dealt with a lot. He dealt with some good, and he dealt with some not middling, but he didn't deal with always the stars, right? I mean, I think about that often, how I used to be amazed at that. You flip it around with Matt Ryan. I mean, this is no disrespect to Matt. We provided with Matt with everything, I believe, right? We provided him with running backs. We provided him with tight ends. We provided him, with bona fide receivers at all levels. We always had a stud receiver in there in our mind, at least while we were there.
And most times too, right.
Even when we went after Cal Ridley, we brought him in because Roddy White had left, and all of a sudden you have Julio, and of course, and then you had some others. We spent our time there. Then we started building our O-line. Of course, people could argue about that. We had tight ends. I'm a big believer, and I took that lead from Bill Polian, right? In Indy, like surround your quarterback with the studs that you can, and if he's good, he can be very good, and if he's very good, he can potentially be a Hall of Famer. You just have to have the right people around you. I think Brock Purdy has the people around him. I think Desmond Ridder has people around him. How he responds to it is going to be, to me, what determines.
Yeah, Peyton Manning to me is the top 5 quarterback of all time. But make no mistake, he took the next step. Right? They had Marvin Harrison and Marcus Pollard, and they took the next step when they got Reggie Wayne in there, when they got Brandon Stokely in there, when they got Dallas Clark in there, and Edgerrin James, and then they went to Joseph Adai after that. He was not without help. And I think that, there are levels, of course, to all of these things. I think this is an interesting discussion. And I obviously, somebody like you has such an eye for talent and stuff. I think that it's a good one to have, because this Purdy thing is gonna mesmerize people. And if he comes out and has a terrible game on Sunday against the Browns in bad weather, then maybe we put it on ice for a little bit. But if he continues to play the way he has, it's going to be a tough conversation, because I think most of us know in our hearts that if you change him out, if you put him in Los Angeles on the Chargers, it's a different outcome than if you put Herbert there.
Of course.
And if you put Herbert on the Niners, it's not as good of one. But I also think that, and this is what I want to end the podcast on too, the coachability, and I say coachability in a different way. Andy Reid is a special type of coach in the sense that he was able to succeed with Brett Favre. He was able to succeed with Patrick Mahomes, 2 guys that I think would be bored in an offense like the Shanahans. And not because they're not coachable, but that's just who their nature is. When you look at Kyle, who have been the quarterbacks? Like Kyle passed on Mahomes for Solomon Thomas, his first draft. And we never talk about that because they ultimately have always drafted well anyway. But it's who has Shanahan really wanted to be his quarterback? Remember, he offered a second to Washington for Kirk Cousins. They ended up with Garoppolo. Now they have Purdy. He's always wanted that quarterback that will color between the lines and who will execute the offense that he wants. And I don't know if it goes as well for him, even if the talent is better, if he has more of an artist like Mahomes or like Josh Allen or like Brett Favre. And I think it's also really interesting to say that like the good and bad gradients, both coaching and quarterback, are not linear. I think that there's good coaches for certain quarterbacks and there's good coaches like Donovan McNabb was not as good of a quarterback as Mahomes, but he was just as much of an artist. And I think that that's something that Andy Reid thrives within. Whereas Kyle Shanahan is more of a guy that likes guys who will color between the lines more so than they are artists. So it's also part of that part too, where the coach, it's a marriage in every sense.
Okay. So then with that said, do you think that makes Shanahan less of a coach or more of a coach? Because look, you know, Socratic thought, right? And know what you don't know, how you approach things. Maybe there's a parallel there, meaning, you know, he knows what he is as a coach and he knows what he isn't as a coach. I'm pretty darn sure. And, or who he can thrive with and who he can't thrive with. I think that's a really, really important thing for any of us, right?
I don't think it makes him better or worse than Andy Reid. I just think it makes him different. And I honestly think moving off of Trey Lance, who I would say at his best was probably more of an artist, I think that was a self-realization on his part that I find endearing. The process of trading for him is whatever. Like they took a shot. I think when they lost to the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, they realized that there was a ceiling to that kind of quarterback. And at first, I think that they said to themselves, well, let's get a more talented player in there potentially than the guy that we have. And I think when that failed, Kyle Shanahan said, well, let's actually just make my scheme that much better, which has been, I mean, this offense has done different things than they have in the past and have been more supercharged. I think the last, 3 years have probably been transformative for Kyle Shanahan, more so in understanding who he is and trying to live within that and deal with the limitations, but also the positives of that, which is to say, he's had success with quarterbacks who are kind of, guys that he can mold, and he probably wouldn't have maybe success as much with guys who are similarly talented, but are kind of more like again, I say artists, but like guys who are more unpredictable.
Yep. Very good. I love your thoughts on it. I'll be interested to see how we continue this conversation. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, this was a great. I think this is a great topic. Hopefully, it was funny. I was like I said on the last show, this past weekend I met up with some NFL people. They really liked the last discussion. I hope that everybody is similarly enjoying this show. I think this is a great topic, and I want to talk about it because I think that there's an edge in being able to evaluate players and understand kind of it's not going to be just by one number and it's not linear, and the interactions between coach and quarterback are not as well. So this has been great. By the way, for all of you who are watching along for the first time, share this show with a friend. For all of you that are watching live, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe button. Go to iTunes or Apple Podcasts, or actually what it's called now. Go to Apple, go to Spotify, give our podcast a rating, especially if you like it. We really enjoy doing this. I really enjoy just being able to pick Thomas's brain and hopefully likewise. Again, tell all your friends about this show. And when it hits big, you can tell them you liked it first. So for Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been episode 112 of the Sumer Sports Show.